CEO's daughter rejects food cooked by all, except by this black single dad. The ending is shocking. The marble kitchen of the Carrington mansion gleamed under the afternoon sun, but Leona Carrington barely noticed its perfection as she paced across the polished floors. Her heels clicked against the stone with the same sharp precision that had built her empire, but today that sound felt hollow. Empty. She hasn't eaten again. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly housekeeper, said quietly from the doorway. Third day this week. Leona's jaw tightened. 7-year-old Ellie sat at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate like puzzle pieces that would never fit together. The eggs had gone cold an hour ago, but neither mother nor daughter seemed willing to break the stubborn silence that had settled between them like fog. What about the chef from Blanc? Leona asked, not taking her eyes off her daughter. She threw the croissant at the wall, Mrs. Henderson replied with a sigh. Said it tasted like sadness. Sadness. The word hit Leona harder than it should have. When had her 7-year-old learned to taste emotions? When had food become another battlefield in their already complicated relationship? Since the divorce 6 months ago, Ellie had developed what the pediatrician called selective eating aversion. She would sit at the table, stare at perfectly prepared meals from world-class chefs, and simply refuse to eat. Not just refuse, she would look at the food with the same expression she gave strangers who tried too hard to make her smile. Leona had hired 12 different chefs in the past month. 12. Each one came with glowing recommendations, Michelin stars, or viral TikTok fame. Each one left defeated by a 7-year-old girl who seemed determined to starve rather than accept comfort from anyone. The temporary agency sent 3 more candidates for today, Mrs. Henderson continued. They're waiting in the service entrance. Leona rubbed her temples. Running a multi-billion-dollar tech company felt easier than feeding her own child. Send them in. One at a time. The first candidate was a young man with perfectly styled hair who spoke passionately about elevated comfort cuisine and Instagram-worthy presentations. He prepared what he called deconstructed mac and cheese with truffle oil foam. Ellie took one look at the artfully arranged plate and shook her head. Too fancy, she whispered. The second chef, a woman who trained in Paris, created an elaborate chicken tender sculpture with 5 different dipping sauces. Ellie stared at it for a full minute before pushing the plate away. It's trying too hard to be something it's not, Ellie said, her words carrying a wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. By the time the third candidate walked through the kitchen door, Leona was ready to give up. She barely looked up from her phone as Mrs. Henderson announced, "This is Malik Bryant." But something made her glance up. Maybe it was the way he moved, quietly, without the desperate energy of someone trying to impress. Maybe it was how he looked around the kitchen, not with awe at its expensive fixtures, but with the practical eye of someone who understood that kitchens were for cooking, not showing off. Malik was tall and lean, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd done real work. He wore a simple white chef's coat that had seen better days, and when he smiled at Ellie, it wasn't the overly bright smile adults usually gave children. It was just normal. "Hi there," he said to Ellie, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm Malik. What's your name?" "Ellie," she replied, and Leona was surprised to hear her daughter's voice. She hadn't spoken to the other chefs at all. "Nice to meet you, Ellie. Are you hungry?" Ellie shrugged. "I guess. But nothing ever tastes right anymore." Malik nodded seriously, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "I understand. Sometimes when we're sad or worried, food tastes different. Like our taste buds are wearing sunglasses." This made Ellie giggle, the first genuine laugh Leona had heard from her in weeks. "What do you like to eat when you're happy?" Malik asked. "I don't remember," Ellie said quietly. "That's okay. Mind if I make something? Not for you to eat if you don't want to, but just to cook. Sometimes cooking helps me think." Ellie nodded, and Malik began moving around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. He didn't ask where anything was stored. He seemed to understand kitchens instinctively. From the refrigerator, he pulled out simple ingredients, onions, garlic, canned tomatoes, peanut butter, chicken stock, rice. "This is something my son Jaden loves," Malik said as he chopped onions with practiced precision. "It's called peanut stew. My wife's family recipe from Ghana. Nothing fancy, just comfort." As he cooked, he talked to Ellie about ordinary things. About his son who was 9 and loved drawing dinosaurs. About how sometimes the best recipes came from people who had very little but shared everything. About how food was just another way of saying, "I care about you." The kitchen filled with an aroma that was rich and warm and somehow familiar, though Leona couldn't place why. It smelled like safety. Like being held when you were scared. When Malik plated the stew over rice in a simple white bowl, it looked nothing like the artistic presentations the other chefs had created. It was brown and humble and completely unpretentious. He set it in front of Ellie without fanfare. "No pressure. It's here if you want it." Then he did something unprecedented. He sat down across from her and started eating his own bowl of stew. For 5 minutes, they ate together in comfortable silence. Ellie took small, tentative bites at first, then larger ones. Then she was eating with the focus of someone who had forgotten what hunger felt like until that moment. "This is good," she said finally. "I'm glad," Malik replied. "Can I have more?" Leona's coffee mug slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the marble counter with a sharp crack. Her daughter, her stubborn, heartbroken daughter who had rejected every meal for months, was asking for seconds. But it was more than that. For the first time since the divorce, Ellie looked peaceful. Like a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. Like she was just a little girl eating a good meal instead of a casualty of her parents' failed marriage. "Of course," Malik said, ladling more stew into her bowl. "There's plenty." As Leona watched her daughter eat with genuine appetite, something stirred in her chest. A memory she couldn't quite grasp, connected to that smell, that taste, that feeling of unexpected kindness. But before she could examine the feeling too closely, her phone buzzed with urgent messages from the office, and she buried the strange familiarity under the familiar weight of work and responsibility. She didn't notice how Malik glanced at her as she typed, a flicker of something, recognition? Curiosity, crossing his face before he turned back to Ellie. "Would you like to help me clean up?" he asked the little girl. "Can I?" Ellie's eyes lit up in a way Leona hadn't seen in months. "Absolutely. Cleaning up is half the fun of cooking." As her daughter laughed, actually laughed, while helping wash dishes, Leona made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Mr. Bryant," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had intimidated boardrooms full of executives. "How soon can you start full-time?" 3 days later, Leona stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor, staring out at the city skyline without really seeing it. The morning board meeting had gone perfectly, quarterly profits up 18%, the new software launch exceeding projections, stock prices climbing steadily. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, all she could think about was the smell. That rich, earthy aroma had been haunting her since Tuesday. It clung to her memory like smoke, surfacing at the strangest moments. During her presentation to investors, she'd suddenly remembered the way steam had curled up from Malik's simple bowl. In the middle of reviewing contracts, she'd found herself wondering why peanut butter and tomatoes together felt like a song she'd heard before but couldn't name. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Carrington? Your call with Tokyo is in 10 minutes. Push it back an hour," Leona said, surprising herself. She never rescheduled international calls. Time was money, and money was control, and control was everything she'd built her life around. But today, she needed to go home. The drive from downtown to her Beacon Hill mansion usually gave her time to transition between her two worlds, corporate shark and single mother. Today, she barely noticed the familiar streets. Her mind kept drifting to that moment when Ellie had asked for seconds. The pure joy on her daughter's face. The way Malik had treated her eating aversion not as a problem to solve but as a feeling to understand. She pulled into her circular driveway and heard something that stopped her in her tracks. Ellie's laughter, floating through the kitchen window like music. Inside, she found them at the breakfast nook, her daughter and this stranger who had somehow accomplished what 12 professional chefs couldn't. Ellie was eating again. Not just eating, she was talking between bites, animated in a way Leona had almost forgotten was possible. And then the dinosaur said, "I don't want to be extinct, I want to be distinct." Ellie giggled at her own joke. Malik laughed too, the sound warm and genuine. "That's a good one. Did you make that up?" "Uh-huh. Malik, can I help you cook dinner tonight? If it's okay with your mom." They both looked up as Leona entered, and she felt oddly like an intruder in her own home. When had she become the outsider? When had sharing a meal with her daughter become something that happened around her instead of with her? "Of course you can help," Leona said, forcing a smile. "What are we having?" "The stew again," Ellie said quickly. "Is that okay? I know it's not fancy like the other food, but it's perfect," Leona interrupted, and meant it. If this simple dish could bring her daughter back to life, she'd eat it every day. As Malik began preparing ingredients, that smell hit her again. But this time, it didn't just tease at the edges of her memory, it crashed through her defenses like a tsunami. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, the sound of industrial dishwashers, the weight of shame heavier than her pregnant belly. A man in a hairnet ladling stew into a styrofoam container, saying, "Take your time, miss. No one's rushing you here." The memory hit her so hard she had to grip the counter for support. 8 years ago. Downtown. The women's shelter on Berkeley Street, where she'd hidden for 23 days while her restraining order processed, and she figured out how to rebuild her life from nothing. She'd been 26, 6 months pregnant, and terrified that David would find her. Her MBA meant nothing when you were sleeping on a cot and washing your one decent outfit in a communal sink. But every evening at 5 o'clock, they served dinner in the main hall, and there was always this stew. Rich and filling and served with dignity by volunteers who never asked questions they didn't need answers to. "Mom?" Ellie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look funny." Leona blinked, realizing she'd been staring at Malik with what must have been a disturbing intensity. He was watching her with concern, his hands pausing in their work. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "That recipe, where did you learn it?" "My wife's family," Malik said carefully. "It's been passed down for generations. Nothing special, just old comfort food," Leona finished, the words falling out of her mouth unbidden. Malik's eyebrows rose. "Yeah. Exactly. It's nothing fancy." The phrase echoed in her head like a bell. She'd heard those exact words before, in that exact voice, though it had been filtered through the chaos of serving line chatter and the desperate gratitude of people who had nowhere else to go. "Have we?" She started, then stopped. It was impossible. Malik would have been barely 18 8 years ago. And the volunteer who'd served her had been just a blur of kindness in a time when kindness felt extinct. "Have we what?" Malik asked gently. Leona shook her head, pushing the memory back into the locked box where she kept all the things too painful to examine. "Nothing. Just déjà vu." But as she watched him cook, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't coincidence. That somehow, impossibly, the universe had brought the person who'd fed her when she was broken right back into her kitchen to feed her daughter when she was breaking too. The thought terrified her more than any hostile takeover ever had. 2 weeks into Malik's employment, Leona found herself doing something she hadn't done since before the divorce, coming home early. Not for urgent crises or forgotten documents, but because she wanted to. Because the sound of her daughter's voice had become a magnet pulling her away from conference rooms and quarterly projections. Today, she arrived to find Ellie setting the table with the concentration of a surgeon. 3 plates instead of the usual 2. "We're having company?" Leona asked, hanging her blazer on the back of a chair. "Malik's son is visiting," Ellie announced, her face bright with excitement. "His name is Jaden and he's 9 and he draws dinosaurs and he's going to teach me how to make them look more realistic." The front door chimed, and Malik appeared with a boy who shared his father's quiet intelligence and gentle eyes. Jaden was tall for 9, with neat cornrows and a backpack covered in dinosaur pins. He looked around the mansion's grand foyer with interest but not awe, the same way his father had looked at the kitchen that first day. "Jaden, this is Mrs. Carrington and her daughter Ellie," Malik said. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," Jaden said politely, then turned to Ellie with a shy smile. "Dad says you like my jokes." "The dinosaur one was the best," Ellie said earnestly. "Do you know any more?" Within minutes, they were deep in conversation about paleontology and puns, their voices fading as they headed toward Ellie's playroom. Leona watched them go with a mixture of happiness and envy. When had making friends become so effortless for her daughter again? "You've worked a miracle," she told Malik as he began preparing their usual stew. "I haven't seen herself, in months." Malik's hands paused in their chopping. "She was never broken, Mrs. Carrington. Just scared. Sometimes when the world feels unsafe, we stop trusting it to take care of us. Food, people, it all starts feeling dangerous." His words hit closer to home than Leona liked. "You speak from experience?" "My wife died when Jaden was 4, Malik said quietly. "Car accident. For almost a year after, he wouldn't eat anything unless I cooked it myself. Wouldn't stay overnight anywhere. Wouldn't let me out of his sight. The grief counselor said it was normal. When you lose someone that important, you start questioning whether anything is permanent." Leona found herself studying his profile as he worked. There was something about his voice, the careful way he chose his words, that felt familiar beyond the shelter memory. Like an echo of an echo. "Is that why you started volunteering?" she asked. "At the shelter?" Malik's knife stilled completely. He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "How did you know about the shelter?" Heat rushed to her cheeks. She'd revealed too much. Let her curiosity override her caution. "I assumed. You said you learned to cook for people who needed comfort food. It seemed like Downtown Women's Resource Center," Malik said slowly. "Right after Sarah passed. Jaden was staying with my mother-in-law on weekends, and I needed something to do with my hands. Something that felt useful." The name of the shelter hit her like a physical blow. Downtown Women's Resource Center. The same industrial kitchen. The same fluorescent lights. The same smell of institutional cleaning supplies mixed with hope and desperation. "The coordinator said cooking was healing," Malik continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "That feeding people was a way of processing grief. She was right. There's something about putting a warm meal in front of someone who needs it. It reminded me that kindness still existed in the world." Leona's throat felt tight. "When was this?" 8 years ago. I volunteered for about 6 months, until Jaden started kindergarten and I needed more consistent work." He paused, his gaze growing more intense. "Why do you ask?" Before she could answer, the children's laughter echoed from the playroom, breaking the spell. Ellie appeared in the doorway, dragging Jaden by the hand. "Look what Jaden taught me!" she exclaimed, holding up a drawing of a surprisingly accurate Triceratops. "He says the key is getting the proportions right first, then adding details." "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Leona said, grateful for the distraction. But when she looked back at Malik, he was still watching her with that searching expression. Over dinner, she found herself studying both father and son. The way Jaden ate with the same quiet appreciation as his father. The way they talked to each other like equals, with the easy intimacy of people who'd survived loss together. The way Malik's face softened whenever he looked at his boy. It reminded her of something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed, the dream of what family could look like. Not the perfectly staged life she'd built with her ex-husband, all marble surfaces and strategic social connections, but something real. Something that tasted like peanut stew and sounded like children laughing. "Mom," Ellie said suddenly, "you look less angry when Malik cooks." The words stopped all conversation. Jaden looked curious, Malik looked concerned, and Leona felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with corporate vulnerabilities. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked carefully. You used to look angry all the time, Ellie said matter-of-factly. Like you were mad at the food for existing. But when you eat Malik's cooking you look… I don't know. Like you remember something good. Like you remember something good. Out of the mouths of babes. Her daughter had identified something Leona herself was still struggling to understand, that this wasn't just about nutrition or even comfort. It was about remembering what safety tasted like. That night, after the children had gone to bed and Malik was finishing the dishes, Leona found herself lingering in the kitchen. She'd dismissed the cleaning service weeks ago. Somehow, watching Malik methodically wash each bowl and spoon had become a meditation she wasn't ready to give up. Malik, she said quietly, the name feeling strange on her tongue. In all these weeks, she'd been calling him Mr. Bryant, maintaining the professional distance that kept her world ordered. Can I ask you something? He looked up from drying a pot, water droplets catching the light like tiny stars. Of course. When you volunteered at the shelter, what was it like? Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion, exactly, but a careful attention that reminded her of how Ellie looked when she was trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. It was… He paused, choosing his words. Humbling. The women who came through there, they'd lost everything but they still had dignity. Still had stories. Still had dreams they were afraid to talk about. He set the pot down gently. Why do you ask? Leona's heart hammered against her ribs. 8 years of carefully constructed walls were cracking, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what might spill out. But something about the quiet of the kitchen, the smell of lingering spices, the way Malik waited without pressure, it all felt like that serving line again. Patient. Safe. I think… She started then stopped. I think I might have been there. 8 years ago. Downtown Women's Resource Center. The dish towel slipped from Malik's hands. You were… He breathed, and she watched understanding dawn across his face like sunrise. The woman in the gray coat. It wasn't a question. They both knew. You remember, Leona whispered. You always said thank you twice, Malik said, wonder coloring his voice. Once when I handed you the tray, once when you finished eating. And you always came through the line last, like you were making sure everyone else got fed first. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 8 years burned behind her eyes. You never asked questions. Never looked at me like I was broken. Because you weren't broken. His voice was fierce, protective. Scared maybe. Hurt. But not broken. Never broken. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity now. 26 years old, 6 months pregnant, sleeping on a narrow cot and trying to figure out how to build a life from ashes. The baby moving inside her, Ellie, restless and strong even then, as if she knew they were fighting for something important. I was hiding from my ex-husband, Leona said, the words coming out in a rush. David. He was charming to everyone else. Successful lawyer, community volunteer, everything looked perfect from the outside. But behind closed doors… She touched her ribs unconsciously, remembering how they'd ached for weeks after the last time. How he'd pushed her down the stairs when she told him she was pregnant. How he'd smiled at the emergency room staff and explained that pregnant women were so clumsy, weren't they? I had $53 to my name when I walked into that shelter, she continued. A bag of clothes and a business degree that felt worthless when I was too scared to use my real name on job applications because he might find me. Malik was staring at her with something that looked like awe. And now you're CEO of Carrington Tech, worth about $400 million on paper. The numbers felt meaningless suddenly, like foreign currency from a country she'd never visited. I clawed my way out of that shelter and swore I'd never be vulnerable again. Never be hungry again. Never depend on anyone's kindness again. But you never forgot the stew. I never forgot the stew, she agreed, laughing through her tears. Or the way you served it. You were so young, 18? 19? 19, he confirmed. It was my first time volunteering anywhere. I was terrified I'd mess up, say the wrong thing, Make someone feel worse instead of better. You made me feel human, Leona said simply. When I felt invisible to the rest of the world, you saw me. Fed me. Treated me like I mattered. They stood in the quiet kitchen, the weight of recognition settling between them like snow. 8 years, 2 different lives, one shared moment of grace that had somehow led them back to each other through the appetite of a 7-year-old girl who understood, instinctively, that some hungers couldn't be satisfied by fancy food. The woman who always wore a gray coat, Malik said softly, shaking his head. She looked like she carried the world on her shoulders. I did carry the world, Leona whispered. I was carrying Ellie. Understanding flashed in his eyes. That's why the stew works for her. It's not just the taste, it's the safety. The same safety you felt when you were pregnant with her. Leona nodded, overwhelmed by the impossible poetry of it all. Her daughter's body remembered what her conscious mind had buried, the taste of being cared for when caring seemed impossible. Does she know? Malik asked. About that time? No one knows, Leona said. I built my whole life on making sure no one would ever know. But even as she said it, she realized that wasn't quite true anymore. Because now Malik knew, and somehow that felt less like exposure and more like coming home. The days that followed their revelation moved like a strange dream. Leona found herself caught between 2 versions of herself, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, and the frightened girl who had once counted every bite like a blessing. For the first time in 8 years, those 2 people were occupying the same space, and the collision was devastating. She couldn't concentrate in meetings. During a crucial presentation to potential investors, she'd found herself staring out the window, remembering the taste of institutional coffee and the sound of women whispering prayers before meals. Her assistant had to repeat questions twice. Her CFO asked if she was feeling well. I'm fine, she kept saying, the lie becoming more hollow each time. At home, she watched Malik with new eyes. Every gesture felt loaded with significance. The way he wiped down counters with the same methodical care he'd shown at the shelter, the way he portioned food like someone who understood scarcity, the way he looked at Ellie with protective tenderness that reminded her of how he'd looked at the women in line all those years ago. But it was more than recognition now. It was gratitude so profound it felt like drowning. This man had kept her alive. Without knowing her name, without expecting anything in return, he had ladled hope into a styrofoam container and handed it to her when she thought hope was extinct. And now he was doing it again, not for her this time, but for her daughter, with the same quiet dignity that asked nothing and gave everything. How do you repay someone for saving your life when they don't even know they did it? The question haunted her through sleepless nights. She found herself standing in Ellie's doorway at midnight, watching her daughter sleep peacefully for the first time since the divorce, and feeling the weight of impossible debt. On Thursday evening, as Malik prepared to leave after dinner cleanup, Ellie wrapped her arms around his waist in an impromptu hug. Thank you for making the sad taste go away, she said into his apron. Malik knelt to her level, his hands gentle on her small shoulders. What do you mean, sweetheart? Everything used to taste sad, Ellie explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children wielded like weapons. Like when you're crying but trying not to let anyone see. But your food tastes like when someone tells you it's going to be okay, and you actually believe them. Leona felt her chest constrict. Her 7-year-old had just articulated something she couldn't. That trauma lived in taste buds, that safety could be seasoned into stew, that some hungers were too deep for ordinary food to reach. After Malik left, Leona found Ellie curled up on the living room sofa, sketching dinosaurs in the drawing pad Jaden had given her. Ellie, she said carefully, settling beside her daughter. Can I ask you something? Uh-huh. Ellie didn't look up from her stegosaurus, tongue poking out in concentration. When you said Malik's food makes me feel less angry, what did you mean? Now Ellie looked up, her dark eyes, so much like Leona's own, serious and knowing. You used to look at me like you were scared I was going to disappear. And you looked at food like it was trying to trick you. But now you look, I don't know, like you remember that good things can happen. Like you remember that good things can happen. The words hit Leona like lightning, illuminating a truth she'd been circling around for weeks. She hadn't just buried the memory of the shelter, she'd buried the memory of being cared for. Of receiving kindness without having to earn it. Of being fed when she was hungry, not because she was successful or valuable or important, but simply because she was human. She'd spent 8 years building walls so high that even good things couldn't climb over them. But somehow, through the alchemy of peanut stew and her daughter's trust, those walls were crumbling. "Ellie," she said softly, "do you know why I like Malik's cooking so much? Because it tastes like love." Ellie guessed. Leona's throat tightened. "Yeah, baby. It tastes like love." That night, after Ellie was asleep, Leona sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, trying to write down everything she wanted to say to Malik. "Thank you" felt too small. "I'm sorry" felt irrelevant. How do you acknowledge someone who pulled you back from the edge without even knowing you were falling? She wrote and crossed out, until the pad was a graveyard of inadequate words. Finally, she wrote just one sentence: "You saved my life twice." But even that felt insufficient. Because it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ellie, laughing over dinosaur jokes. It was about the way her daughter's eyes lit up when she heard Malik's key in the lock. It was about how a traumatized little girl had found her appetite again because someone understood that hunger was about more than food. Malik had given them both something Leona had thought was lost forever: the ability to trust that the world contained people who would feed you without asking what you could give them in return. As she sat in her silent kitchen, surrounded by marble and steel and all the armor wealth could buy, Leona realized that she was more grateful for 23 days of peanut stew than for all the 5-star meals her success had afforded her since. And tomorrow, she was going to figure out how to tell him. The next evening, Leona arrived home to find Malik teaching both children how to make bread. Ellie and Jaden stood on step stools at the counter, their small hands buried wrist-deep in dough, flour dusting their cheeks like paint. "You have to be gentle but firm," Malik was saying. "The dough can feel when you're scared of it." "Like people," Ellie said solemnly. "Exactly like people," Malik agreed, and something in his tone made Leona's heart clench. She watched from the doorway, marveling at this scene that looked nothing like her childhood dreams of family but felt more real than anything she'd ever imagined. Her daughter, covered in flour and completely content. A kind man teaching her that feeding people was an act of love. A little boy who'd lost his mother but still believed in the goodness of homemade bread. This was what safety looked like. Not the marble counters or security systems or bank accounts that could weather any storm. Just people caring for each other with their hands. "Malik," she said quietly, stepping into the kitchen. "Can we talk?" He looked up, flour in his hair, concern immediately creasing his features. "Of course. Kids keep needing. We'll be right back." They stepped onto the back patio, the evening air soft with the promise of summer. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker to life in the distance. "Do you remember the woman who always said thank you twice?" Leona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik turned to face her fully. "Every detail. What else do you remember about her?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for permission to speak a truth they both knew was coming. "She was pregnant," he said finally. "About 6 months along, I'd guess. And she was scared. Not just of being hungry or homeless, but bone-deep scared. Like she was running from something that could finish her." He paused. "She had bruises on her wrists that she tried to hide with long sleeves, even though it was July." Leona's breath caught. She'd forgotten about the bruises. "And every night, after she finished eating, she'd put her hand on her belly and whisper something to the baby. I always wondered what she was saying." Tears slipped down Leona's cheeks before she could stop them. "I was telling her she was going to be okay. That we were going to be okay. That someday she'd have enough to eat and a safe place to sleep and people who loved her." "You were telling Ellie," Malik said, wonder in his voice. "I was telling Ellie." Leona wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And you know what the strangest part is? She kept those promises. Every single one of them. Even though I never told her about them. They stood in the growing darkness, the weight of 8 years collapsing into this single moment of recognition. That woman, Malik said slowly. What happened to her? After she left the shelter? Leona laughed, but it came out broken. She clawed her way through business school on scholarship. Worked 3 jobs while raising a baby. Built a company from nothing because she was terrified of ever being that hungry again. She became someone who could never be vulnerable, never depend on anyone's kindness, never be afraid. And was she happy? The question hit her like a physical blow. No, she whispered. She was successful. But she wasn't happy. She'd forgotten what kindness tasted like. Until now. Until now. Leona looked at him through her tears. Malik, do you understand what you did for me? What you're still doing? I served you stew, he said simply. You saved my life. You fed me when I was starving. You treated me like I was worth caring about when I felt worthless. You gave me strength to fight for my daughter's future. Her voice broke. And now you're doing it again. You're feeding her the same safety you fed me. Teaching her that the world contains people who will care for her without asking what she can give them back. Malik's eyes filled with tears. I had no idea. I was just trying to help. That's exactly why it mattered, Leona said fiercely. Because you didn't need to know my story to treat me with dignity. You didn't need me to earn it or deserve it. You just gave it. Through the window, they could see the children still kneading dough, their laughter floating out into the night like music. I want to offer you something, Leona said. Not just a permanent position here, but I've been thinking about starting a community kitchen initiative through the company. Partnering with shelters, training programs, places where people need not just food but dignity. Would you help me design it? Malik stared at her. You want to? I want to pay it forward, Leona said. The kindness you showed me, I want to multiply it. Make sure other people get fed the way you fed me. With respect. With love. Leona, Malik said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. I would be honored. Inside, Ellie called out. Mom! Malik! Come see our bread! It looks like a dinosaur! They looked at each other and laughed. Real laughter, the kind that comes from recognizing that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles wear the disguise of ordinary grace. As they walked back toward the kitchen, toward the children and the bread and the promise of sharing another meal together, Leona realized that she'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. The food didn't change their lives. The love behind it did.